So it's around 9 a.m. a couple Fridays ago, and I'm home with my three daughters. Sydney, she's 5, Eleanor, she's 4, and Vivian, who's 9 months. We're frantically trying to get out the door on our way to some quality time at the Friday Tot Zone at Quantum Sports. It's my first Friday off in a while, and I am determined to make it count, earn those dad points. I'm holding Vivian, pleading with Eleanor to go potty before we leave, and ignoring the incessant requests from Sydney to turn on a show for just a minute before we leave the house, when through the chaos, I hear a knock on my door. And so with one kid in my arm and another refusing to potty by hanging on my leg with her pants down, I open the door to a young, naive entrepreneur going door to door, selling a bundle that I couldn't resist. I can save you so much money if you will switch your basic cable, Wi-Fi, and landline telephone to me. Young and naive, it was clear he didn't know how to respond to the noise and chaos that emerged from that door opening, but undeterred, he launched right into his scripted pitch. About 20 seconds in, he stopped and said, "Seems like I caught you at a bad time." "Yeah, man, it's not the best time." "No problem." Not expecting the next question. "So when can I come back and finish why I came? When would be the best time to show up at my door unannounced to offer me a bundle of basic cable, Wi-Fi, and a landline telephone? I don't know, man, like 20 years ago?" And here's the deal. That's a bit how Easter feels for some of you. Here I am, barging into your life like a door-to-door salesperson, here to tell you about this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get your life right with the potential that has the potential to sound to you as outdated and unrelatable and unhelpful as a landline telephone. A relic of the past that you're surprised anyone still has, much less that there's people who dress up on stages and peddle this stuff. And I get it, after all. At the end of the day, the entrepreneur didn't want to save my family money. He wanted my credit card and a 1-year contract. So maybe you're sitting here looking at me and you're saying, "I really love the single origin coffee that you offer, and I love the kids program and the nice photo op spots, and so far you seem relatively normal and relatable. But you're here to tell me once again about a first-century Jewish peasant who rose from the dead somewhere around the turn of the first century, half a world ago, and that's supposed to mean something to me here and right now, right? Like that's the gist, that's the message we showed up for? Yeah, sounds about as helpful as a landline telephone." That's how Easter can feel for some, like a relic of the past with no power or purpose in the present moment. Jesus is cool and all, but that's my mom's thing. And that was then, and this is now. And so if any of that resonates with you this morning and you're just kind of passing through on the way to your Easter family lunch here for the nostalgia and the sentiment and to appease your family member, let me not shame you with anything I just said. I want to acknowledge that reality and say you are so, so welcome here. We honor your presence and your journey that would have you at any point of the spectrum. We are so glad that you are here, and you are welcome here today and any other day. But the truth for me is that I actually do believe that the resurrection of Jesus is the most decisive event in human history. And I don't believe it because I bought the pitch of some door-to-door salesperson peddling this story from a stage back in my childhood. It's because there was a time, and there's been many times, when the resurrection event so intersected with my own story that it changed me, and it is changing me, and it's the best explanation to the life I'm actually living and hoping for. For me, it's been a profound moment of clarity, and it awoke something in me that's never been able to go back to sleep. So for you today, if today is mostly like a B-level holiday about bunnies and eggs and photo ops and pastel sweaters, then you're probably just stopping by, and again, we're so glad that you're here. But if for today celebrates that moment for you that's resurrection, that moment of clarity, the moment that intersected with your story and it changed everything, if that's who you are, then I just want to say again, Happy Easter, He is risen. He's risen indeed. And so I want to talk to you about this moment of clarity called resurrection, the way you talk about any other moment. It's through two questions. What happened, and what does it mean? We know the story. We've grown up on this story, but what does it mean? First, what happened? Pope Benedict once wrote that being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. What happened? An event and a person. One of the things that distinguishes Christianity from other faith movements is that it traces its origin back to a definitive moment in time and place and history, and that event is resurrection. And the resurrection can't help but to carry so weight that if it is real and if it is true, then we can't help but not sentimentalize Jesus. It's not really an option. It means that Jesus can't be so easily dismissed as just an admirable person or a respectable teacher. That doesn't fit with the history. It means that, in the words of C.S. Lewis, that Christianity, if false, is of absolutely no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be on a day like this is moderately important. But of course, to consider the resurrection of Jesus is to show up in the middle of a story, not just a single event. Because resurrection is an event and it's a person, Jesus, the teacher, friend, influencer, before that was a thing, who never wrote a book for himself but is widely the most widely selling author on planet Earth. Miracle worker, God incarnate, who gave his life in brutal fashion for the sake of you and I. Resurrection is a person, Jesus. And you know the story, you know his death scene, you know the symbols, you know what that is about. But strikingly, what isn't surprising or significant about Jesus' death is that it was on a cross. Many people died on a cross during that time in history. It's that his death was promised, and it was given. It was offered willingly and purposely. It wasn't the heinous act of a barbaric god or the plot of the religious and political establishment that put him on the cross. It was love. It was love that put Jesus on the cross. An event called resurrection, and a person, Jesus, who willingly died for love. And again, that's not so new to you and I. But things get a little trickier when you get past the retelling of the event and the bio of the person. You say, well, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for my family, for my future? What does it mean beyond the response I gave in my childhood and the baptism of years ago, potentially? What does it mean? How does my life, thousands of years removed from this event, halfway across the planet in this small town we call the Valley, how does it intersect here? Well, I want to borrow a philosophical framework to come around that question today. The framework has 4 categories, each with their own question. And they are origin, category 1, how did we get here? Meaning, what's the point of it anyway? Destiny, what happens after we die? And morality, how do we live in the meantime? First, how do we get here? How did we get here? Resurrection is an event that takes place as part of a larger story, a story that begins in the book of Genesis. The biblical book of Genesis, for all the debates and all the conspiring, it emerged from an ancient Near Eastern world that in and of itself had lots of what they called creation myths. And every other creation myth is about a battle between a pantheon of gods where the victorious God, who either kills or subdues the others, then creates out of his win. In contrast, the Genesis story is unique because it imagines God in harmonious community, not war. All to say that every creation story imagines God in the deepest part of his character as power, and in Genesis, in the deepest part of his character, it is love. And his creative act is not one of domination, but it's one of love. A God who creates in love, that matters to the story. It's like a happily married couple who looks at one another one day and is like, you know, the love we share is so good. What if a little bit of me came together with a little bit of you and we created something together that we could direct all of our love towards this baby? It's like that. And contrary to all the debate, page 1 of the Bible is entirely about love, about perfect love between God and people walking together in the cool of the day, and perfect love between people and people, naked and unashamed, literally and metaphorically. And as beautiful as that first scene is, the second scene is quite devastating. The forbidden fruit was tasted and the perfect love corrupted. Genesis 3 says it this way, that then the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. In this moment, naked and unashamed, a perfect view of the self was replaced by insecurity and anxiety and shame. And perfect union between people relationally was replaced by perfecting and pretending and presenting and performing and all the self-interest that we are plagued with. The story continues. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Familiar sound. But this time it was different, and they hid from him. Did you catch it? They've gone from walking with God to hiding from God. It's really the distance that all of us are pretty familiar with. It's when God becomes not knowable or intimate anymore, but instead really hard to know and even harder to trust. And if you want to see the effect of the Genesis story, how did we get here? You don't have to do a deep dive into ancient literature. You just need to look at the world around you. Loneliness is the word we use for the separation that entered the world between people and other people. You know, current research tells us that the number of close friends the average person among us has declined by 1/3 in the last 20 years alone, to the point that 53% of all Americans claim to have no close friends at all. That's devastating. Sadly, the arc of human history is bending away from one another, not towards each other. It's one of increasing separation when we were made for more connection. And that confronts the deepest longings of our own hearts, which is to be fully known and to be fully loved. And at the same time, it collides with our greatest fear, which is to be unknown and unloved. And so the experience for most of us in the room, even when we show up on days like this, is we're here, but we're still hiding, is to settle in the space that is unknowable and therefore unlovable. The separation that entered our story has mutated itself into loneliness between people and other people. But that same separation has caused a divide between me and God, and you and God. And it shows up in another word, shame. They heard the sound of God and they hid. See, shame is different than guilt, because guilt is about behavior, but shame is about your identity. Guilt is I've done something wrong. Shame is something is wrong with me. Guilt is I'm sorry I made a mistake. Shame is I am the mistake. Shame is very easy to experience, but very difficult to define, because shame is a storyteller. It's a force that gets into our guts and then tells a story with our lives. And strangely, it's often a story that we disagree with here, but we tend to live out from a deeper place that's unknown to us within. And there's endless varieties of stories that shame tells. They are dramatic, and they are subtle, and they are nuanced, and they are abrasive. But I believe underneath every one of those stories is fear, not love, humming. So look, I don't know if the Bible feels like all of what I just said feels like a landline telephone to you this morning. And believe me, I've had my own journey and questions and struggles. And you have permission today to dismiss the Genesis story if you want. But I don't think you can dismiss the Genesis diagnosis. That every last one of us is haunted by the looming clouds of loneliness and shame. And that, my friends, is what the Bible calls sin. And it's less a moral judgment and more just like an honest diagnosis that something is deeply wrong in me and in the world. And it's as broad as genocide and world hunger and systemic injustice and school shootings and piles of rubble that are dotting the war zones throughout the earth. And it's as personal as shame and loneliness and the constant struggle to know who we are. Creation is, you are the masterpiece of the original artist who looks at you with eyes of love and love only. Sin is, and the fight of your life is going to be to believe that. Because every other force in you is trying to convince you that you have to drum up your own lovableness to become lovable in your own eyes, what you already are in God's. And so to believe in resurrection is to believe that the Creator's version of the story overcomes your story of shame, your story of loneliness, and your story. That the God who created in love, who is love in his essence, also redeems by love. And that his great passion is to redeem every square inch of creation and every square inch of you. And my instinctive response to that, and your instinctive response to that, is just like them in the garden. Hide. And then prop up religion. The instinctive response of most of us to that story is to try to earn back the thing we lost. That's called religion. Religion is, I messed up, so I'm going to go to God to make it right by proving myself, doing all the right things, and trying to show God that I really mean it this time. Religion is trying to earn back what was lost by the same method you lost it in the first place. And if you're honest, maybe that's even part of what drove you here this morning. But hear me. Resurrection of Jesus is not religion. It's an invitation to come out of hiding, fully known and fully loved by the God who never stops pursuing you in love. That is resurrection. And that is the question that philosophers have long been trying to answer of, how do we get here? Then there's meaning. What's the point anyways? Church can sometimes feel like the guy who, burdened by his own guilt, tries to get a workout in while he's on vacation and eating his way through it. You know, you're just trying to do the right thing. The only problem for this guy is when he showed up to the gym, there were no parking spots left. So he circled again. No parking spots. Circled again. No parking spots. And so he said, well, in a deal with God and myself, I tried. Peace out, back to the room and the beach. Sometimes searching for meaning feels like that. Like you're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to find meaning, but there's no room, there's no space for it in your life. And I don't know how welcome your own journey of spirituality and questions has been inside your inner circles of friendship or your family or in previous church experiences. But let me tell you here, like we throw the door wide open to that journey. And here's why. Because I believe that any honest and sincere search for meaning has to eventually deal with Jesus. Because no one ever claimed what Jesus claimed. In John 14, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's absurd unless you actually are that. Jesus claims to be in and of himself the meaning of life. The Word that was at the beginning, who created in love for love, not in domination and not in obligation. He is that meaning. In other words, he is saying, I am the direction that gives your life a coherent purpose. I am the meaning that makes sense of a really complicated world. And I am life at its most potent and full. If there's no space in your life at the gym, keep circling the lot because Jesus will meet you there. And that's a pretty big claim. And honestly, it's a little bit triggering because that's pretty darn exclusive. What do you mean I am the way, the truth, and the life? When we talk about truth and we hear exclusivity to our modern ears, that can be tough to buy into, and I get that. But there is a more ancient way to talk about truth, and it has less to do with claims of exclusivity and more to do with direction. It's something like this. If you were to shoot an arrow, and that arrow shoots straight where you are aiming at the target, that would be called, not a shot Matt Davis has ever made, that would be called a true shot. Meaning the arrow, which has been designed perfectly to do that, has flown perfectly as it was intended to. In other words, the truth was proven by using it. So truth, in the most ancient sense, is something that is taking you where you are aiming to go. So then here's a question for you on resurrection morning. Is who or what you're allowing to give meaning in your life taking you where you're aiming to go? Is it true in the sense that it's proving to be true as you use it? Is it shaping you from the innermost parts of your creative being into the best version of yourself? Is it moving you into the direction of peace or a little bit more towards anxiety? Is it moving you in the direction of love or a little bit more of this direction of self-centeredness? Is it moving you towards the direction of joy or just survival and melancholy, Eeyores? Is it joining you to a story that's big enough to hold your purpose, your passion, and your potential? You see, there's a bit of a myth around how most of us view the end of everything. It's that the Bible ends with God swooping in to take all the believers away into a faraway paradise. Like the world's a sinking ship and you can load into this lifeboat if you hear the news in time. And if that's what you've been looking forward to, I don't want to burst your Gaither music reunion. That's a whole inside joke of a thing. I shouldn't have said it aloud on Easter Sunday. Stop. That's just not the story. And if that's what you think it is, I'm so sorry, because the juxtaposition at the heart of the Bible is about the renewal of this world, not the beginning of a new and different world in some faraway place. In other words, your meaning is directly tied to the end of God's story, which is this, that God's not trying to get people into heaven as much as he's trying to get heaven into you and I, here and now. And so the surprise of Easter morning is not that there is hope and meaning somewhere out there in the distant future after death. It's that there is hope and meaning here and now because Jesus, by conquering the day, crushed the divide that was disconnecting that. Resurrection isn't only about security after death, it's about meaning right now. And there is not a moment or a molecule in your life that is too small or too big to have ultimate meaning in Jesus Christ. Resurrection is the rebuilding of paradise on top of the rubble of your story and the rubble of this world. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy. Afraid, yet filled with joy. That was the reaction to the resurrection of the first witnesses. Resurrection might have made their future more secure, but it also made their immediate life more complicated and risky. At the same time, though, the meaning they found in Jesus made their fear worth walking through. Afraid, yet filled with joy. Finally, something bigger to live for than just the endless toil of Project Self. Finally, something big enough to hold my entire life. Finally, something bigger, not just than my final resting place, but my here and now, my children, my every waking moment. Resurrection doesn't mean happily ever after. Resurrection means afraid, yet filled with joy. Resurrection doesn't mean a perfect life or an easy life. Resurrection means a life so charged with meaning and purpose, you actually want to live it, here and forever. Paul said, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless and so is our faith. In other words, if resurrection is just a rumor, then let's quit wasting our time. Let's just have a potluck fashionably dressed with pastels. Let's go home. Well, this is too hard. What's the point? You do you, live your truth. But if it's true, it changes everything. So let me ask you again. Is who or what you're allowing to give you meaning taking you where you're aiming to go? Is it proving true as you use it? Is it making you the best version of yourself? And is it big enough to live for? That's the real test of truth. So we have squared two philosophical questions for the entire world. They're done being debated. I solved them. Origin and meaning. That's not true. But sorry, Mom, there's this whole thing about death in the afterlife lingering. Sorry, we got to go there. Because meaning is incomplete without considering that question. And you must dignify your life by asking that question. I'll never forget, if I get emotional, I'm getting emotional. I've been a basket case today. I'll never forget the day my best friend's dad lost his life in the most tragic of ways. He was a phenomenal dad and a great husband. Present, loving, attached, involved, complex but relatable, snarky, so snarky, but beautifully genuine and loving, would lay down his life for anyone. I'll never forget how those first hectic hours turned into the first days after his loss, and then when we found ourselves about to lay his earthly body to rest, my friend's little sister, someone who's like a sister to me, turned and asked me a question that cut through every moment that I've never forgotten. Just a teenager at the time. Matt, do you really think that Dad is finally at peace? Do you really think that? The first witnesses to resurrection were not gullible religious fanatics. They were grieving women. They were carrying spices to a tomb, which is the ancient equivalent of taking flowers to a grave. You see, the resurrection story becomes more profound the nearer you and I get to suffering. For our modern ears, I think it's very scandalous for many people to acknowledge Jesus as Lord, exclusive claims. But for many people in the ancient world, the most scandalous aspect of Jesus' claim was that the Lord would suffer. A God who weeps, a God who bleeds, a God who dies, God on a throne, sure, but God on a cross, never. It's not compatible. And I understand why it's such a shock that God would suffer, but I also think that a God who doesn't suffer probably isn't a God worth trusting. Because without the courage to take his own medicine, to crawl down here into the darkness with the same desperation and helplessness as the rest of us, how could we trust any God with that journey for ourselves? David Benner said it like this. He said that ultimately, we need a meaning strong enough to make suffering sufferable. This is the crucial test of any life meaning. It has to help us live life. And for it to do that, it has to help us cope with suffering. And so not to be morbid or a killjoy this morning and not to guilt you into some decision that's based in your fear like a door-to-door salesman, young and naive, but most of us don't give enough thought to the inevitability of our own deaths. We pass through our days under the illusion of immortality, and that works most of the time. It gets us by on most days. But then, one day your best friend calls you because death walked in like an unwelcome guest, kicking the door down and hijacking your routine and all your expectations. And in that moment, the illusion is over and all the questions buried beneath the surface bubble right to the top. And that's a difficult moment, but it is critical. And it sent Leo Tolstoy, an author, into the most epic journey of his life that he said, my question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions. Is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? Can I tell you something that you know, but often we live our lives ignoring? You're going to die, and you can't take anyone or anything with you. I'm not trying to be morbid, but I am asking you to dignify your life now by considering that reality. And when Jesus carried the cross on his back, he was carrying more than just a cross. It was more poetic and symbolic than that there was a tree that brought humanity into that devastation scene, and now it's a tree that's going to bring it back to life. It's more beautiful than that, as beautiful as that is. It's that Jesus was carrying the groans and the weight and the sin of all of creation. He was carrying the consequences of all human wrong, the weight of all human suffering right there on his back, even death. But Jesus, in his beauty and his act, who has created and lived for love, it is who he is from the very beginning, gives us a picture of love right there in that moment that is bigger than death. Because the claim of resurrection 3 days later is that there is a love that outlives death. So there I was, standing with my best friend's family, when this grieving young girl who just lost her dad pierced through the moment. Matt, do you really think that my dad is finally at peace? In that moment, her question wasn't about some future existential thing. It's about her dad laying 20 feet away from where we were standing, his body there, but he was gone. Her question had a face, a pain, a story in the future she was now being forced to live without him. Matt, do you really think my dad is finally at peace? What would you have told her? You see, the resurrection, without the resurrection of Jesus, all she has is her grief. The lights went out. That dad whose hugs she could still feel in her body, whose jokes still ring in her memory, whose scent is still fresh on his clothes, and whose picture she'll never delete or take off her childhood banister. Without the resurrection of Jesus, that's all there is, grief and loss. But through resurrection, it means that the worst thing that can happen is never the last thing. Through resurrection, through the cross, it means that suffering is a place that God can be found, not a place that God is absent or distant from us. It means his method of bringing you hope isn't protection, it's redeeming every part of your story. It means he doesn't promise to protect you from every bit of pain, but he does promise to redeem every bit of your pain. And that's in every kind of pain, from a paper cut to funeral grief to long stretches of suffering. It means resurrection, that there is, in fact, something that death cannot take. Because Jesus and only Jesus makes suffering sufferable. So the last question, now that you've considered that. Happy Easter. So what about the meantime, dog? What do I do in the meantime? This is the philosophical question that's underneath morality, because morality is less about a list of rights and wrongs, and it's more about how we live life wedged between things like loneliness and shame that none of us, regardless of the vices or the virtues we use to govern our lives, none of us get to live immune to. So I have a friend whose life has gone wildly different than anticipated. A lost career, 2 broken and irreparable marriages, financial bankruptcy, back living with his parents, once the thrill-seeking extrovert, now reclusive shell of himself. And so for my friend, sometime just before the pandemic began, the compounding effect of his own choices and the harmful choices of others toward him got so deeply enmeshed in his identity that he started to live almost exclusively defined by his shame and by his loneliness. Shame because he couldn't bear to see himself, much less allow God to see him. He hid. And loneliness because his shame was so severe, he just withdrew. And to this date, he hasn't found his way fully back. How could someone else love me if I can't love myself? To be fully known and unloved, that's unlivable. And so he settled where most of us tend to settle, to be unknowable and therefore unlovable. Hidden and ashamed. You see, shame, loneliness, and the pain of what was and the loss of what could have been leached into him like a parasite and created a story he couldn't bear living, and so he escaped it. And today he's fighting for his life, not just spiritually or relationally, but more deeply. And you know, the thing about any kind of coping mechanism is that they work. Almost. It's hard to give up something that almost works. And what Genesis named fig leaves almost works. Escaping almost works. Hiding behind what makes me feel okay, what makes me feel in control, it always almost works. Throwing myself into my career or my kids or my appearance or a bottle of something strong, all of it almost works. Pick your poison. It almost works. But inevitably, reality sets in, and you realize it doesn't work. And you can admit that in desperation, or you can just admit it in flat-out honesty. But whatever you and I are using to cope will eventually be shown as weightless as it actually is when you're desperate or when you're honest enough to see it. So my friend in his current state is the one who is yet to come out of hiding, yet to make himself knowable and therefore lovable, yet to be in his own eyes what he already is in God's. 1 John 4, perfect love drives out fear. You see, love overwhelms fear for everyone courageous enough or desperate enough to come out of hiding. And this isn't a love that dismisses our wrongs. It's a love that overcomes our wrongs with forgiveness. Forgiveness is God's way of restoring to you the Genesis worth that he intended for you at the very beginning. Remember the beginning of the story? A God who created in love and looked at the community of God and said, let's create something to direct more love towards. Forgiveness is God's way of restoring you to that without you needing to prove yourself. Forgiveness is why resurrection is about God being loving enough and you not having to be good enough. The only way that you can avoid God's forgiveness is to stay hidden, to keep on coping, to convince yourself again today that you can sort this out on your own, in your own time. You just need a little longer. You see, resurrection is about loneliness and shame too, because it brings them to an end. It turns hiddenness into a lie and being seen into coming alive. My friend, to this very day, sits alone, hidden, physically encumbered, lonely. There's no happy ending to his story yet. And his journey is not yet over. And no one's story is ever beyond the redeeming work where God's pursuing love. And every day I pray for him and for others who are one decision away of some sort of courageous act that would say, I am desperate enough, vulnerable enough, forgiven enough to step out of hiding and to come into God's presence. That's what resurrection is about. The fixed, loving gaze of God that casts out fear. So I'll wrap with this. After the resurrection, in a period of about 50 days, Jesus and his resurrected body appeared to more than 500 eyewitnesses. But the first that he appeared to on that original Easter Sunday were two disillusioned, dejected ex-disciples on their way out of town on the road to Emmaus who were trying to cope with their new profound grief, disillusionment, probably a little bit of resentment towards this guy that claimed to be something, and now he's dead like the rest of us. They were trying to cope by walking away, escaping, which always almost works. And there's been a lot of artistic depictions of this moment, but this one is my favorite by far. And what you'll see is that there are two disciples in plain view and Jesus just an outline. He's with them. He's with them every step of their way of escape. But they're having a whole lot of trouble recognizing him. And it took them all day to figure it out. God's kindness never withdrew. It took time, though. Resurrection is about love. And when they woke up to the presence of God's love expressed to them and Jesus literally walking with them, their hearts began to return the love, and that overwhelmed the fear that was driving them away, and they turned to meet Jesus again on this road. You see, resurrection and all of it, every category, every question, every human experience, every story has always been about love. It's about the God who walks beside you even when you walk away from him, content to wait for you to recognize him whenever you're ready. It was love that endured the cross, and it was love that pushed back the stone. And when you realize that all of love is pointed directly at you, I think the best way to say it is afraid, yet filled with joy. Afraid because receiving this love means letting go of everything that's made you feel comfortable and secure. Even if it's coping, at least I'm familiar with it. It almost works, man. But filled with joy because it means reaching out to try to grab everything that you actually deeply long for. After the resurrection, Jesus made 500 appearances to different people. He walked into rooms. He met people on the beach. He came to them in ways that spoke directly to their longing, their need, and who he was. And let me let you in on something this morning. The risen Jesus still walks in the room. He still walks into rooms, calling the names of his children who are hiding, calling them out of their shame and out of their loneliness into being seen and into being known, into becoming lovable in their own eyes, that which they always have been in God's. And some of you can feel that happening right now. And you are afraid, yet filled with joy. Like your name is being called out of whatever you're using to cope, to be seen, to be known. What if right now wasn't the moment where you bought into my entrepreneurial sales pitch to save some money on your Wi-Fi landline bundle, but is actually a moment in which God is meeting you on your road to wake you up to the reality of his love towards you? What if the moment of clarity that I have experienced and others in the room have experienced, that is where you come fully alive to your meaning and to your purpose and who you are, and you experience forgiveness in a way that feels redemptive, not punitive, and God is who he says he is, and you look around and you see the world through color when you've been seeing it in black and white your whole life? What if today, what if this moment is actually one decision away from experiencing that moment of clarity? And if right now what you're feeling is like afraid, but full of joy, that's God's kindness. That is God reaching. And what if the rest of your life would be different, not because you learned to project a certain thing or perform a certain thing or show up on certain days, but your life became different because you just accepted the invitation that Jesus is laying in front of you, that he's never retracted from you, and this is your moment on the road to your future where he becomes fully alive in you. And what if for others, this isn't a moment of a beginning point, but it's a way that it's like a fresh moment of inspiration, a fresh moment of clarity where the veil of your own struggle and whatever you're using to cope and distract can be peeled away to see God for who he is and to see yourself for who he is. What if right now is your moment of life-changing clarity? You get to decide. And there are a lot of things that I don't know. And there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered, and there's a lot more laps around that gym. There's lots of hurt yet to be healed. There's a lot of becoming who I am in Christ, and there's a lot more purpose to live into. But here's something I undoubtedly know that's true for you. It's that Jesus is just too good to resist. He's too good to keep hiding, coping, pretending, and projecting. He's too good to put off another day. So my invitation is this: come out of hiding, afraid and filled with joy. Would you stand? Whether this is your first Sunday with us or your 1,000th Sunday with us, something that's become more normal to us in this moment is to take on a prayer posture. It's actually an ancient prayer posture where we just plant our feet firmly to the ground, we close our eyes, and we put our hands up with our palms open, extended to God. And it's really just a physical way to connect the dots for those deeper places in our soul and connect our body with it. There's nothing magical about the pose, but it is a sign of our surrender and receptivity to Jesus. And so I'm just going to pray 3 words that are ancient words. It's very simple. It goes like this: Come, Holy Spirit. And I invite you to pray the same thing. Come, Holy Spirit. For those of you on one end of the spectrum that is responding to this morning by saying, I am still too curious, I've got questions, I'm too broken, I'm too hurt, and you're not ready to take that step, where you're not going to be forced to do anything. God loves you too much to try to get you to pretend. But I hope that you sense God's loving invitation towards you nonetheless. But for others that are experiencing something right now that is coming somehow fully alive in these words and in our moment of reflection that feels a little bit more like you're afraid, I pray that as we reflect that you would lean into that fear so that you can be met with Jesus along the road. See, fear is a wake-up call sometimes too, that there's danger if you keep practicing what you're practicing, if you keep taking that road to the inevitable end. But Jesus is so gracious that he meets us in our place of fear, he replaces it with love, and he redeems that moment in our story. So if you're afraid today, lean into your fear and find Jesus. And if you find yourself filled with joy this morning, filled with joy for the moment of clarity you're having or the moment of clarity that you have had in the past, filled with joy for your salvation, filled with joy for the healing and the mending of your soul, filled with joy for hope that's rising up within you, and maybe it even had been dormant for a while. If you are filled with joy, as we sing with joy. Offer your lives with joy and with fullness and wholeheartedness and clarity to God. And for those of you that are one decision away from yielding your life, repenting, asking for God's forgiveness, and turning around towards the love that has never stopped pursuing you, I pray that in this moment your life would become alive. Your soul would come alive. That you would yield your spirit, your life, in whatever way is connecting what's real about your experience to the God that is real right there beside you. What right now looks like an outline becomes a fully embodied moment. And so Jesus, here we are on Easter morning, celebrating resurrection. From every walk of life and every story and every question and every point on the spectrum of this spiritual journey, would you meet people exactly where they are, because unannounced, and even when we don't want you, you have this habit of showing up and calling us out of hiding and into love and into life. Jesus, Holy Spirit, would you come? And we bless the work that's happening in every human heart as we sing together.